Right, I'm going to start the meeting. So good evening, everybody. Welcome to this Jimmy Reid Foundation event. Before we kick off, I just want to inform everybody that the meeting is being recorded so that we can put it up into our YouTube channel. The information about how you can access the recording later will be put into the chat function on Zoom. Now, the fact that you're all here tells me that everybody's at least able to use Zoom to an extent. But there's a couple of things that I want to just kind of help you through, make your experience this evening better. You will be muted other than those that are speaking. If you want to get the best view of the evening, can I suggest that on the top right-hand corner, you click on speaker view rather than gallery view, unless you want to see everybody else that's in the meeting. You'll get the best view of the person that's speaking at the time. And we will be showing slides, so it'll be easier to see it if you're on that function. We've opened the chat function, so feel free to comment in there. Some of our speakers tonight will be happy to answer directly within the chat, and at the end of the main presentations we will be selecting some of the points raised in the chat for a wider discussion with our speakers. So that's some of my technicals out of the way. I'm Lynn Henderson. I'm the chair of the Jimmy Reid Foundation project board, and this is the second event that we've put on in 2021 to commemorate the 50th anniversary of the UCS working. There will be other events, and we'll be informing you in the chat about the next one that's coming up as the evening commences. So tonight, what you've registered for is a discussion about leadership and trade union struggles and the lessons that we have learned from Jimmy Reid and UCS. And I've got some fantastic presenters for you this evening to introduce and talk around this subject. We've got four people this evening. We've got Dr. Bill Knox and Professor Alan McKinlay, who are authors of the Jimmy Reid, A Clyde Built Man book that came out in 2019 that we launched in the Unite building in Glasgow. It's on sale and you can get a 30% discount tonight, and the details will be put in the chat and have been sent to you before you registered for this event. If you want to get hold of that, we highly recommend it. So Bill is a retired academic from St Andrews, and Alan is a professor of human resource management at Newcastle University. Following their presentation, we're going to have, if you like, a response from a couple of very senior trade unionists in Scotland, and that will be led by Mary Alexander, who's the Deputy Regional Secretary for Unite in Scotland, and then Roz Foyer, who's the STUC General Secretary. Following the four speakers, I will kind of open up for read out some of the points that are raised in the chat and ask the speakers to kind of respond to that at the end. So it's going to be kind of a fun-packed evening. There's a lot to cover. So I'm going to just kick off first of all by asking Alan and Bill to take over the screen and do their presentation.
Hi there, thank you very much, Lynn. Bill and I are delighted to be here, delighted to be taking part in this Jimmy Reid Foundation event. Behind the scenes, Tam, if you can put up the first slide, that would be perfect timing. There we go. Before we begin though, and it's always invidious to select out a few people from many who've helped us over the years in producing this book. We interviewed 60, 70 people. both veterans and family members and former colleagues of Jimmy Reid. But amongst those folk, it seems to me we need to identify three in particular. Two of them, John Foster and Charles Wilson, wrote the definitive book about the UCS working. So we really are standing on their shoulders tonight. And the third person is a journalist, Brian McGeechan, who was very kind and generous and gave us access to a set of interviews that he had done with Jimmy over the last 20 years of his life. So that was a great privilege, and we thank Brian greatly for that. I'm going to say a few words just to give you an idea of where we're going to go this evening. I'll start off with a few words about the background to UCS, because it seems to me that that's quite important, that the working understandably gets the foreground, but something about what UCS was and what it hoped to be, that seems to me is an important starting point. The second thing Bill and I are going to talk about is who was Jimmy Reid. We're going to give a pen picture, if you like, a very, very short pen picture of his political life up until UCS. Thirdly, we're then going to take a sharp left turn, if you'll excuse the expression, and have a look at the Communist Party shipbuilding branch, which was behind the scenes and was very important in our interpretation, certainly, about how the UCS working was conceived and organised over that kind of long campaign. Fourth, and this is my favourite little bit of the UCS story, and it's only really a tiny little part of the story, but it seems to me massively important, massively interesting, and very perfectly cheeky, audacious. And that's about how the UCS working was imagined in a Clydebank tenement. So I'll say a few words about that. And then fifth, we'll say something about the UCS, the working, and the Communist Party, which has been singularly humble about its role in the working, both in the run-up to it and the organisation of it. And so hopefully we're going to restore the Communist Party to its role in the UCS working, which has been somewhat neglected, which is particularly odd given that John Foster and Charles Wilson were both communist activists as well as academics during this period and after, of course. Tam, could you give me the next slide, please? So what was UCS? UCS was Upper Clyde Shipbuilders, which was a consortium of 5 yards initially, including Yarrow's, and all the way down to John Brown's. Yarrow's withdrew very quickly, and there's always been a hint of conspiracy about why and how Yarrow's withdrew from the consortium, and did so with huge alacrity. It bought itself out of the consortium for a peppercorn price. So you had 4 yards left in the UCS consortium, and its objectives were really quite ambitious. I think it's important to recognise that. It was about modernisation. It was about modernising production, modernising management, employment relations, all to deliver high-end efficiency and productivity. It really was an attempt to change the nature of shipbuilding in the UK, and to do so on the Clyde, on the Upper Clyde certainly. Next thing to recognise is that UCS was always financially fragile. It was always precarious. It never had enough working capital. Despite its ambitions to modernise, it never had the capital to really improve. Some of the yards, especially Connell's, were notoriously under-equipped. It was really a 19th century yard trying to meet a 20th century ambition, a late 20th century ambition for modernisation. And that financial fragility tipped over in 1971. The shopshoers themselves and many others saw this collapse coming. They knew it was fragile from the start. But this financial crisis was triggered by the Heath government withdrawing standard overseas trade guarantees, the sorts of things which are standard practice now and then, where the state would underwrite contracts with foreign governments or foreign buyers and underwrite the process. It was a kind of trade insurance almost, very, very commonplace. So the decision to withdraw those at a time when they were delivering contracts for 14 ships really put an intolerable strain on the UCS finances, and that was the collapse. That was the reason for the collapse. Tam, next slide, please. So we've seen that the UCS, from its establishment, was something of a race against time to deliver productivity improvements through eliminating production bottlenecks, standard ship designs, modernising management, and so forth. But these normal commercial guarantees were withdrawn, and they were withdrawn abruptly in the end. And the reason was that the government expected UCS to be broken up quickly. That's very important to recognise. It wasn't just that UCS was allowed to collapse or caused to collapse, but it was to precipitate a fast crisis. The government did not want to have anything, or didn't, and certainly did not expect a year-plus campaign. The liquidator here is Robert Courtney Smith, who was one of these dapper men who you see in Ganexes and trilbies, when Ganex coats and trilbies were the hallmark of the kind of man about town. And he was a very shrewd accountant, Glasgow-based, and he was appointed as the liquidator. And it turns out that he, to our reading, was something of an unlikely and somewhat unsung hero of the UCS story. And why do we say that? Well, the liquidator, Courtney Smith, was a very shrewd businessman and soon realised that he could discharge his legal obligation to deliver best value for creditors, but do so in a way which was going to take a little bit longer. It wasn't going to be an immediate crash. He did a sort of 3-week audit initially of the state of play in the yards, and they discovered, for instance, that they had something like £1.5 million of stock, of steel stockpiled. So they were ready to build ships. Equally, he realised that there were 14 ships who were on the stocks or on order. So this was not a firm which was collapsing because of a lack of demand, quite the opposite. This was a busy set of shipyards. He had contracts, and the way that contracts for ships are paid is they get paid in stages. So he knew that he had a certain predictable cash flow, and he had this massive asset of free materials. So the commercial decisions taken by Courtney Smith opened up the time required for the UCS Shop Stewards campaign, as we'll see just in a moment or two. Tam, fourth slide, please. All right, so I'm going to ask you to bear that, keep those thoughts in mind about the UCS, about the background, especially that question about time. And we're going to rewind and ask, who was Jimmy Reid? All right, this is a kind of parallel story. Jimmy Reid became known for that lifelong commitment to socialism, to a kind of Marxism. And Jimmy was not unusual in the way in which he came to this. It was through family tragedy, direct family experience of poverty. And he writes in a very much an unpublished memoir. It was really scraps rather than anything which was consistent or coherent. He writes movingly, "Another of my sisters died in the dawn of the new year. Auld Lang Syne rang out from the surrounding slums as people tried to drown out the miseries of the old year in cheap booze and mawkish sentiments. While this was going on, my father had his dying daughter cradled in his arms, beseeching God to save her life." And he describes his mother rocking slowly forwards and backwards on her stool by the fireplace, softly moaning. So needless to say, for most Scottish families, the Reids treated New Year as a particularly ambivalent celebration, one tinged with great sadness as well. That was something that never left Jimmy, and they made sure that his mother was never left alone on New Year's Eve, Hogmanay, for precisely that reason. That left its mark, as we'll see. Tam, could we move on, please? So let's stick with Jimmy. As a young child, he was the youngest of the family, and he was coddled as only the youngest child in a family will be. Reid was precocious and deeply anti-authoritarian. He was active socially, tried out a variety of different political hats, but he came to the Communist Party in the 1940s. And it was a relatively easy thing to become a communist and govern in the 1940s, despite the Cold War, insofar as the Communist Party provided a political and social life in Govan. There was things for teenagers to do, there was things for young families to do, and so forth. So there was a part of the Communist Party which allowed not just a political growth, but a social growth, if you like, as well. The Communist Party provided Reid with his intellectual understanding of capitalism, not just youthful instinct. So it went beyond instinct. But as we'll see in a moment or two, this was not an uncritical one right from the start. So to become a communist was to become more than a member of a political party. It was something which was more than politics. And it became a political vocation, a way of life for the individual, and often for entire families. In fact, Reid married into the Swankie family, which was a family of singing, dancing sisters, and a mother and father who were both active communists, especially his mother-in-law. So this is the Communist Party that he joined. It was something which was more than just a political party, but it was one which was especially demanding on its full-time cadres, which, as we'll see, Jimmy Reid became. Tam, next slide, please. So when did Jimmy Reid become an important member of the Communist Party, if you like? Well, from 1952, Reid was one of the leaders of the Clydeside apprentices strike, which within its 3-week span had grown to become a UK-wide campaign for wages and better training for apprentices. This was one of a whole series of apprentices strikes, which started in 1911 and ran all the way through 1941, 52, and then into the 60s. So this was Jimmy's generation of activists in Glasgow and Manchester, Birmingham, and so forth. He became a known figure in the Communist Party, in Glasgow's left, in the AEU as well, a predecessor union to Unite. And here we see a picture of the young Jimmy, complete with cardigan, speaking at a Clydeside apprentices. So this is him 19 or 20 years old. And the young man sitting next to him is Dick Douglas, who later became a Labour MP. By 1955, Reid had been singled out by the Communist Party leadership to, quote, be a mass leader. Communist Party at that time did a really good thing for social historians. They produced effectively personnel records where they evaluated each person's performance and what development opportunities were required of them in the coming year or two. So they would identify, and they were very searching annual reports, if you like, on these young comrades. And Reid was identified as a warm comrade who drew other young comrades to him. But, and here we see something else, he required personal and theoretical discipline. So yeah, he was a disciplined young communist, but also he was treated with, there was something not quite disciplined enough for that generation of Communist Party leaders. Dan, next slide, please. What was going on in Glasgow around the same time was we had was the formation of the Communist Party shipbuilding branch in 1961. It's hard to underestimate how important this group was in shaping the thinking and the language of the communist activists who became the core of UCS working. So it was partly about getting to know each other, sharing information about wage rates and so forth, the kind of thing that any group of shop stewards would do if you gathered them together regularly. It was also a point at which they spoke and learnt a language where it was about the political limitations of economic disputes as they saw it. It was the fact that you could not build a working class solidarity, a language of solidarity based on economic disputes, which were notorious in the shipyards after 1945. Equally, and very importantly, they practiced this language inside their own ranks. They were really endless caustic jokes at the expense of the Boilermakers, who were one of the, who styled themselves as the kings of the Clyde. They were the shipyard trade and demanded and enforced strict demarcation on the one hand and trade premium wages on the other. This, it seems to me, is important because this is the place where these men learn to talk about the work in it as developed a language of the Popular Front. There weren't many of them, granted. At its peak after 1971-72, after the work in, there was something like 110, 120 members would turn up. But before the work in, there was something around 60, with a core of around 20. But that included people like Airlie, Jimmy Airlie, as well as Reid. So they had a presence and some degree of influence across the 4 yards in the Upper Clyde, or the 5 yards in the Upper Clyde. Next slide, please, Tam. And this is the part which I think captures my imagination, certainly. How did you come up with it? The work-in was a novel tactic. There was no playbook for this. They did not have a template, a campaign model to follow. So how did they come up with this notion of a work-in? Well, a strike, all of them recognised very quickly. Reid put it, as he put it, was just to fall into the employer's hands, fall into the Heath government's hands. They would have cheered us out of the yards. Once we're in the street, they'll padlock the gates. We've done their job for them. So there was no point in that. An occupation, which was considered, was likely to be short-lived, explosive, and would bring in the police, would create images of which were entirely counter to the type of long-term campaign that they'd hoped for. So where to go? Well, a group of them, 6 or 8 of them, it's not entirely sure how many, turned up in Bob Dickey's flat in Clyde Bank. And his young daughter, was sent out for more cigarettes, more coffee, rolls, and some square sausage. So there was some serious thinking getting done, you can tell. We're planning to stay in his flat till they come up with something that might work. They decided that since there was 14 ships under construction, there was ample materials in the yard. They had some sense of what the liquidator was likely to do. They concluded that this was devise a new tactic, an entirely new tactic, a work-in, which they understood to be a long campaign to be managed rather than a kind of explosive event to be staged. So that's very important. So you've now got the liquidator going for a slow release of funds, and you have a group of shop stewards, not all communists at this point, but certainly the vast majority, the clear majority of them communists, imagining this working. And that to me is just audacious. Audacious. The sheer audacity of these men exercising this political imagination to come up with the idea of the work-in, a campaign that was going to directly draw the state into the open and force, as Reid put it, the faceless men behind these closures into the public spotlight. That was the whole point, was to draw the government into a hand-to-hand combat where the stewards would be able to have a kind of constantly take the initiative. That was the plan. But as I say, they were flying without a compass here. They didn't actually have a playbook to follow. Next slide, please. As we say, one of the most important aspects of the work-in was that the key figures, with very few exceptions, were communists. We see a picture here of Reid and Jimmy Airlie by his side, and these were men who had learnt how to speak, how to organise, how to raise finances. They had access to a network of through the Communist Party and the trade union movement, which was nationwide and beyond. They had an idea, an imaginary of the work-in, which was going to be a campaign where they were going to politicise this dispute. But they had to do it in such a way, and they chose to do it in such a way where they kept the Communist Party itself at arm's length from the leadership of the work-in. It's quite deliberate and quite carefully thought through, and not without controversy inside the Communist Party. Again, quoting Reid, the party could not be involved. The party was confronted by UCS. So the UCS was a popular front. In Bob Dickey's kitchen in Clyde Bank, The idea was that UCS was going to become the people versus the state. These men representing the Clyde side, Scottish and indeed the British working class, were going to confront the faceless men of the government. These were decent working people, and we'll all remember, and I resisted the temptation to upload the image of them. There will be no beving, there will be no, we are in front of we are in the world's eye speech, which gets replayed endlessly. But that does speak to the sorts of ideas of respectability, decency, and a right for decent work, a right for a decent living, a right for communities to live well, with economic security, that they were projecting. So this was the people's demand, if you like, not just the defence of particular shipyard jobs, but to mobilise much beyond that, to try and raise the issues about the right to work. So it was to become a moral critique of capitalism's failure to deliver safe work, secure work, decent work, at the same time as it was going to be the defence of these particular jobs. So UCS strategy was to mobilise alliances. That was the essence of it, and that was the tried and tested practice of communists inside the shop stewards movement in Glasgow and Glasgow shipyards. They were never powerful enough to exert direct influence. They were always had to build coalitions. They always had to look for ways of making alliances. And the key thing that the UCS stewards demanded was that all 4 yards had to be saved. You could not cherry pick what ones to be to lop off. Okay. If we can move on, Tam. So here's where I think it becomes important, where there are resonances for how we think about political leadership and campaigning now, not just in the work-in. I think that the leading figures, especially Reid and Airlie, had to speak as everyman. The work-in had to expand its message to include all working class communities. So it couldn't speak from just for its own specific requirements. It had to find ways of going beyond that. And that was certainly one of the great achievements of the UCS work-in leadership. It found ways of doing that. It found ways of articulating that. And I'm going to make a few comments about why that happened to such great effect in a moment or two. But for the moment, it's important to recognise that the work-in was unthinkable without communists, but it would be impossible if left to communists alone. So hence the Popular Front. That language of solidarity, which had been built over a decade and more inside the Communist Party networks in Glasgow and beyond. We highlighted the shipbuilding branch from established in 1961. The third point is that they stressed the importance of building alliances inside the shipyards. Remember, these are yards, 4 separate yards with possibly four different destinies. They are each of them had a dozen, 15 and more trades, all with their own trade unions. This was a messy political process. This was complicated and difficult political work that they were doing to build alliances inside each shipyard, across all 4 shipyards, and then to step beyond that into civil society, to reach out to churches, to other political parties, to the wider trade union movement and beyond. It could not just be the Labour Party and the Labour movement, and it had to go beyond that. And they did that by defining the campaign in terms of everyone's right to work. And that was the aspiration. So this becomes a moral critique of capitalism rather than a criticism just of the closure of these yards. It was everyone's right to work. Next slide, please, Tam. And here we have a picture of Jimmy without his cardigan on. So it's obviously a nice summer's day in Glasgow. The leadership was deliberately kept open. They recorded more or less all the meetings, courtesy of Jimmy Coughlin, and these huge reel-to-reel tapes. They kept minutes. All decisions were referred back to the rank and file every opportunity. This was transparent and open collaborative and shrewd. Yeah, they knew that they had to keep the 4 yards together and all the trades together at all times. And they had to have this, to do this almost to create a space for themselves to articulate this other version of what the UCS could do. Second point, again, vitally important, was that the UCS leadership was proactive. They were not waiting for things. They were always positive about keeping the yards open, even when they had ridiculous prospective buyers, like what was it, Cash Down Kelly, basically a kind of rag and bone man, a scrap metal merchant who was Reid gets wakened up from a deep sleep, which had been induced by a doctor's injection, given endless cups of coffee so that it can fly out to one of the Scottish Islands to meet Cash Down Kelly. They basically have to walk him around his room, his flat in Clyde Bank, pouring coffee down him to get him awake enough, sufficiently awake to get him on a plane to meet Cash Down Kelly. So they were always receptive to any positive moves, but they were proactive. The UCS, and especially Reid, used language that was authentic and eloquent. I think that's very, very important. He was somebody who spoke in terms of a language which was, he was speaking not on behalf of the working class, but from the working class. So people recognised that, warmed to that, that resonance of somebody who was clearly part of a working class. It seems to me this is vitally important. That campaigns are won and lost, not just in terms of their immediate impact, but that longer term capacity to speak to a wider public, speak to a wider set of public concerns. So why does it matter now? Why does Reid's language in UCS matter now? Well, it seems to me that Reid's speeches were at times mischievous, at times teeming with a barely contained rage. You can hear that in various occasions. There was an authenticity to Reid's language. This was not a man speaking on behalf of workers so much as speaking from the working class. And that was a consistent voice. Where Reid's speeches really cut through, he spoke with defiance, humour and indignation. He asked questions of all of us then and now. Are we prepared to settle for an economy and a politics that is careless of lives, families and communities? This is why Reid and UCS continues to matter. Thank you. Thank you, Lynn. That's me said my little piece.
Thank you very much, Alan. And your little piece was really rich, not just with anecdotes, but with kind of real depth of political strategy. And it reminded me just of the quality of the information contained in the book. And I'm saying again, if anybody's joined since we started, in the chat, you can see how you can order your own copy of Alan and Bill's book with a special discount from Liverpool University there tonight. Those of you that have joined since we started, just to let you know that we are recording this meeting. So if you've missed a beginning or you've missed any of Alan's presentation, it will be available on our YouTube channel. And that Bill will be available to answer any questions or points, and he's happy to do them live in the chat. Anybody that wants to ask any questions or make any contributions, if you put it in the chat, I will be kind of going back to that at the end to take questions and give it and go back to our speakers. So I'm going to hand over now to to the first of our respondents, if you like, and I'm going to ask Mary Alexander from Unite the Union to now reflect on lessons for today from the UCS and Jimmy Reid. So over to you, Mary.
Thank you, Lynn. I'm delighted to be asked to speak at this event on behalf of Unite. Jimmy Reid was drawn from that great tradition of worker activists who stood up for what they believed in and who struggled to ensure that the legitimate economic and political demands of their class were met. Jimmy and the others did this not for the benefit of themselves, but for the wider benefit of those they represented, those with whom they worked and the communities from which they all hailed. Each was inspired by those who had gone before them. This body of great trade unionists include Glasgow-born Mary MacArthur, who in 1910 led women chain makers in striking for a living wage. And of course, Mary Barber, Red Clydesider, and like Jimmy Reid, born in Govan, who played a pivotal role in the rent strikes of 1915. The tradition of worker activism has continued since Jimmy Reid's day. The Lee Jeans sit-in celebrates its 30-year anniversary, witnessed the largely female workforce barricade themselves into Lee Jeans' Greenock plant to save their jobs and their communities. An action led by all the women, which began in February 1981 and lasted 7 months. The company claimed the factory needed to close, despite having a fairly healthy order book. They learned their lesson the hard way. Don't mess with the workers of Greenock and don't mess with women workers. All of those involved in these disputes and campaigns had a number of things in common. Firstly, they were inspirational leaders, be it individually or collectively, successful in setting public consciousness alight by highlighting the issues at stake, be they starvation wages, equal pay, rent strikes, or factory and shipyard closures. In the case of the Lee Jean action, the reps travelled the length and breadth of Scotland, speaking to trade union groups and raising money for the sit-in. Jimmy Reid and the shop stewards involved in the Upper Clyde side working kept solidarity, morale, and determination to succeed up by frequently updating the workers and taking the message out to the wider public and politicians in Westminster. Another major ingredient in the success of these campaigns was the clarity with which the leaders articulated their demands and their determination that there would be no retreat. And Alan touched a bit on this. In the UCS working case, it was the 4 shipyards that had to be saved and no less. In Mary Barber's case, the message was clear. Rent strikers, we're not removing. For the Lee Jeans workers, the call they made was that they would stay until we heard something different. In the shipyards, such was a level of consciousness, which again, Alan has talked about, that the communist philosophy, that Jimmy Reid, the inspiration, and Jimmy Airlie, the organizer, together with the 2 Sammies, successfully persuaded workers offered redundancy that the social good trumped the individual gain and kept them in work via the work-in levy. They used their powers of communication and organising skills to demonstrate the centrality of solidarity to successful action and the priority of the collective good over individual gain. Another similarity is the political aspect of each struggle. All of these leaders understood that the fight was not just with the employer, but with the political establishment and ruling class of the time. Their struggle was representative of the struggle working class people were facing as a whole, and knew a win for them could have the potential to change the lot for working class communities by showing what was possible when workers come together and fight back against rogue employers and a political system set up to reward the wealthy and keep the working class down. Sounds familiar? Think Boris Johnson and the private sector-led test and trace contracts benefiting his class to the tune of 37 billion. One thing all these inspirational leaders did was they all took to the streets to show the public and politicians that they were prepared to sit in or strike for their cause. But they also marched to show the strength of collectivism and solidarity. In August 1971, the huge UCS support march in Glasgow drew over 80,000 supporters as the fight for jobs and the right to work chimed with the wider concerns about growing unemployment of the time. As Reid himself said, "We started fighting for jobs, and in a matter of days we knew we were fighting for Scotland and for the British working class movement." Capturing the public attention was a tactic used by our comrades a century ago with the rent strikes and the UCS working, and it's a tactic still used effectively today. In 2009, Unite's Bassa cabin crew took on the might of British Airways and its chief executive, Willie Walsh, who were seeking to impose reduced crew levels and transform conditions to the detriment of staff. In the face of government opposition, legal challenges, and a barrage of adverse media coverage, the solidarity and resolve of this diverse workforce and the effective use of campaigning techniques sustained the 22 days of strike action, which saw mass participation in rallies and on picket lines, ultimately leading to successful defence of their union and core conditions. Whilst the pandemic has put paid to mass rallies and protests for now, Unite's organising used leverage and digital advantages to considerable effect in communicating key union campaign messages against BA's fire and rehire tactics by projecting digital images on key buildings, then using these in a combination with other channels of communication, such as social media, to get their message across to the general public about BA. Some may say that with social media now firmly embedded in our culture, and with its ability to reach far beyond the limitations of a physical demonstration, that the days of taking to the street are gone. However, notwithstanding the pandemic, I disagree. I'd argue that advances in technology should be used in addition to physical presence. During the campaign against RBS branch closures, which I led on behalf of Unite a couple of years ago, we used a combination of protests outside bank branches marked for closure, using our area activist committee, our community members and retired members for support, as well as petitions and social media to spread the campaign messages against the closures. We took the campaign to Westminster and Holyrood, tabling parliamentary questions via supportive politicians, participated in committees of inquiry, exposing the hypocrisy of the RBS in closing viable branches, where the bottom line was that their profit margins weren't big enough in working class areas, and they really didn't care how the vulnerable, the elderly and poorer communities would be able to access services in the future. Whilst the campaign by Unite and other community organisations ultimately was not successful in preventing the wholesale closure of branches, RBS committed to no further closures for 2 years and the provision of mobile services. The campaign also shone a light on the potential impact of the relentless move to a cashless society in terms of perpetuating the class divide and increasing inequality, leading to the access for cash review. It also highlighted the reality of digital exclusion in many communities, which is all too prevalent now, and the pandemic has really shone a light on that. More importantly, the campaign also demonstrated to the wider public the fundamental role trade unions play in their local communities. The world as we know it has been turned upside down over the past year, with the pandemic acting as a wrecking ball to the economic and social order, leaving industries such as aviation in free fall and hospitality and retail mothballed and relying on the job retention scheme to keep people in work. Every sector has been affected, from passenger transport to finance and construction, to name a few. Whilst many employers have utilised the furlough scheme to keep their workers in a job, other more profitable employers have shamefully chosen not to keep workers in a job because of the costs they would have to bear for pension and NI. And I've heard that so many times, it's unbelievable. Large-scale redundancies have hit most sectors, with Rolls-Royce in Shannon hitting the headlines, Edinburgh and Glasgow airports seeing thousands of casualties, and companies that have been around for years, such as Alexander Dennis, suffering big job losses as bus orders plummet. Of course, Alexander Dennis recently have been awarded a contract for 170 new green buses, which is very welcome, but begs the question of the Canadian owners as to whether they should have sacked the workers they did in the first place with the job retention scheme in place until such times as things picked up again. Despite the Rally Round the Calais campaign, the historic Springburn railworks tragically went to the wall, with the Scottish Government firmly choosing to turn the other cheek. More recently, we've witnessed governments in Holyrood and Westminster stand idly by as jobs in green technology have been outsourced around the world, when Scottish communities should have been benefiting from renewable energy contracts. Workers, including those at BIFAB, who took to the streets to raise awareness that jobs that could be done here in Scotland were being awarded to countries thousands of miles from Scotland's shores. BIFAB workers fought for their jobs and continue to fight for a fair share of the work. Fire and rehire has become the new way to attack workers' terms and conditions under the auspices of COVID-19. There is an epidemic out there of unscrupulous employers who believe that they can get away with simply firing workers only to rehire those on inferior pay terms and conditions. BA was the first one out of the starting blocks, followed by British Gas, Rolls-Royce, and recently Tesco Livingston, all jumping on the bandwagon, making COVID-19 the excuse to reduce their costs by slashing terms and conditions and attacking workers' rights. Pay deals have been few and far between, with pay freezes and cuts to terms and conditions the order of the day. I offer solidarity to Siaka packaging members in Edinburgh striking against imposed change to their terms and conditions, and Fastlane and Coalport workers striking over pay and bargaining rights on the Clyde naval bases. In construction, many employers are taking advantage of COVID to flex their muscle and attack their workforces, bringing more in on short-term contracts, with members not knowing whether they have a job from 1 week until the next, until the boss chooses to tell them on a Friday. COVID has also intensified the rush towards automation. Home working has been the order of the day, with all manner of businesses rushing to decrease their property portfolio. Local authorities and public sector employers are also jumping on the bandwagon, and who knows how our city centres will look and feel post-lockdown, and what the impact reduced activity will have on the businesses reliant on the ebb and flow of people coming to work. So what lessons can we learn from the leaders of the past that are still relevant today, given the hardship and trauma many of our members and their families are experiencing, with loved ones lost to COVID-19, jobs gone or changed forever? During the pandemic, the trade union movement has been at the centre of fighting for workers' rights. The introduction of and extension to furlough, improvements in health and safety, PPE provision, enhanced sick pay. I could go on, and I'm sure Roz will touch on that. But all of these have been the result of trade union campaigns and negotiation with governments at both UK and Scottish Government level. However, we should be under no illusions that we have a mountain to climb. Key workers in the NHS, local authorities and third sector organisations who have worked so hard and selflessly throughout the past year or so have shown the public their true worth. It will require the influence of strong, determined and organised trade unions to put the case for and deliver the pay reward key workers so richly deserve. The pay proposals we have seen today for NHS workers in Scotland is a promising start, and it will now be up to the members to decide whether that's sufficient given the years of underfunding and the terrible trauma they have had to work through over the past year. That same determination and resolve will be required in bucketfuls for local authority and other public sector pay claims where key workers have kept essential services going. So a new landscape is unfolding of automation, home working and the greening of jobs, which will herald profound changes in society and the way we work. We as unions need to think beyond the idea of traditional ways of organising. How do we organise fragmented home workers, for example, given large groups of workers on large sites are no longer the norm? Unions now need to look at ways to engage and encourage individuals to come together under common issues. Unite's Who Cares for Carers campaign has been able to do just that, utilising the spotlight on social care workers during COVID to push for better terms and conditions and collective bargaining for all social care workers. We need to digitalise our campaigning around common issues using virtual meetings. We need to organise meetings within sectors using combines and build a common agenda for sectoral bargaining and push the Scottish Government to deliver on the much trumpeted Fair Work agenda. We need to extend our social media reach and employ leverage where we make all interested parties aware of the treatment of our members to achieve our campaign objectives. Watch out, Amazon, Unite is coming for you soon. I can see that I am running out of time now, so to go back to what we started with and what the UCS working brought to the table. I'll finish with the inspiration, the solidarity and determination and clear pathways to achieve our aims that the Jimmy Reids, Mary Barbers and the fighting women of Greenock have shown us will always be fundamental to delivering on our members' objectives. Solidarity, comrades. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mary. That was really a beautiful wraparound of Alan's presentation and placing the UCS, the leadership and Reid's work in the context of the Red Clyde side that went before, the women of the Clyde, and then your detail on more recent struggles, bringing us right up to date, has been really kind of inspirational and talking about some of the new ways of organising and new ways within the pandemic of doing things like the BA projections onto buildings and so on. Mary, before I'm going to take Roz in a minute, but you might want to look at the chat. When Roz finishes, I'll go back to some of the points people have raised in the chat, because while you were speaking, you'd be interested to know that Jane and Liz and Alan and Callum and Kenny have all commented as you were speaking, and there's a kind of theme emerging around some of those about organising workers, not just in industrial disputes, but linking that to community organising, and I think that the examples of UCS and some of these examples that you've given about the Royal Bank of Scotland and the branch closures and digital exclusion and so on are all very much linked to that kind of struggle. So we will come back to you, and we'll come back to all the speakers at the end, but I think that you might be particularly interested in when we look at that while Roz is speaking. I'm sure she'll be interested in responding to some of that as well at the end. So next up is Roz Foyer, who is the General Secretary of the Scottish Trade Union Congress. Most people here, I think almost everyone here will have known Roz over the years as a Unite senior organiser, as an STUC campaigner, as someone who led the Free School Meals campaign when she was a younger woman, and in her early career as a member of my union, the PCS, as an activist in that. So I want to welcome Roz to make her contribution tonight.
Thanks very much, Lynn, and thank you to the Jimmy Reid Foundation for inviting me here tonight to talk about some of the lessons that the UCS dispute still holds for us and for our movement today. I'm also going to draw some parallels with other more contemporary successful industrial action campaigns, and just think about how reflecting on UCS can assist us in really kind of evolving what we do as a movement going forward, and really thinking about how we can increase our impact in these highly, highly challenging times. So there's no doubt that the personal characteristics that you heard about earlier, you know, in the leadership style of Reid, Airlie and the others who led the dispute played a key role in the UCS campaign, and in that campaign achieving its ultimate goal of keeping all 4 of the yards open. But for me, the most powerful attributes that those activists brought to the table was the fact that they weren't general secretaries, they weren't union officials, but they were the genuine, credible voices of the workforce. They were the elected voices. They were the shop stewards movement in those affected workplaces. And so as workers on site, they had the real skin in the game. They were the most credible people to speak for that workforce. And they were directly involved in the fight for their own jobs. They showed people the human face of that dispute, and they had a degree of passion that really captured the imagination of supporters across the globe. And I think a real part of that was because people could see that they had, you know, and the workforce themselves could see that they were, you know, part of them and had as much to lose as every other worker that followed them. So they were the ideal sort of workplace leadership that you want to see in an industrial action. And I think that really mattered, because when the stakes were high, I think that because it concerned them and their colleagues and their peers, they were able to take more risks, make less compromises, and really fight with every fibre in their being to build that winning strategy that they did, to see their plan through and stick to the key demands that they'd outlined at the beginning about the 4 yards, and really deliver the win and see that through to the end. And I think that the points made about the fact that they were part of a well-supported and developed team. There was already a broad and experienced shop stewards committee in place. There'd been a lot of political education done around, in and around the shipyards, and the Communist Party played a role in that. And you know, there was a really wide leadership team in that shop stewards committee, a real broad organising committee that could take that collective responsibility for the big decisions that were made in the campaign. And the fact that they took time to really define what their plan was going to be, what their aims were going to be, to define at the very beginning what their win looked like and what their demand looked like, and who were the decision makers that they were going to target, and then really thinking very, very carefully about not only their strategy of action that they could get people involved in, you know, what was the collective action going to be, but also building a really powerful narrative around the right to work, and that concept that was deeply, deeply emotive, and it was also very widely felt. It was something that lots of people could buy into. And I think what the wider movement, definitely in Scotland at least, got right at that time was in realising that UCS was a strategic moment for our whole movement, and that this was a win that was going to really matter. And, you know, just like a sort of stone dropped in a mill pond, that a positive outcome for UCS would produce wider implications across our politics, our economic and our industrial landscape that would have lasting consequences. And, you know, that real and practical support, you know, very much came from the wider movement. The STUC was centrally involved at the time, and played a crucial role to supporting the dispute. That wasn't just through the kind of the normal things like fundraising and helping to build community support, but also through undertaking a number of supportive strategic campaigning actions that helped to deliver the campaign plan that the stewards had devised and set out, and they were able to, you know, ask the STUC to help deliver some of that. And that included things like the STUC at a very early stage, the General Council being one of the first bodies to endorse the shop stewards working strategy, which the fact that it had been endorsed by the STUC helped to build confidence right across that whole workforce that they would be able to mobilise support and solidarity from across the movement. They also helped to organise the delegation that went to Westminster to lobby ministers and hear the emergency debate in the Commons. And hundreds of Clydeside shop stewards joined the delegation at Westminster, and sat in the public gallery for that. They also facilitated meetings with government, and my understanding is that STUC officials also worked very closely with the shop stewards, and, you know, were invited to attend the mass meetings of the workforce and to attend meetings of the stewards, which meant that they were able to really hear what was required and understand what help and support was needed, although it was very much the shop stewards that took the lead in that. And I think that meant that, you know, they helped organise a range of wider movement mobilisations. The first special congress that the STUC had ever held was held around the UCS dispute, and hundreds of shop stewards from across Scotland attended that special congress. That led to the mass demo and march to Glasgow Green, in which the 80,000 participated. There was a high-profile public inquiry launched and facilitated by the STUC that looked into the social and economic consequences of the decision to run down UCS. And that was a really, really key tool in helping to keep press interest alive and just keep that drip, drip, drip of new stories as new witnesses were called, new evidence was brought to the table, allowed the shop stewards to control the narrative of the campaign and escalate slowly and turn up the heat and the political pressure bit by bit on the key decision makers, who were, of course, the government. And, you know, there were the explosive Ridley papers that were supplied to the inquiry, you know, in great drama by Jimmy Reid to further expose and build on the impression of a really callous government-led conspiracy that was all about getting rid of the yards despite their growing economic viability. So all of these sort of different tools helped keep things in the public eye, helped win the public support. And, you know, alongside the General Secretary at the time, Jimmy Jack, a lot of the work around this was actually done by Jimmy Milne, the Deputy General Secretary of the STUC, who was himself a former shipyard worker. And my understanding is also that there were figures like Mick McGahey of the Scottish Miners and Hugh Viper, who was the Secretary of Glasgow Trades Council at the time, who were also really, really key actors in supporting the dispute and speaking out to support it. And all of the effort at the end of the day was well worth it, because when those UCS workers won, all workers won, and it gave workers confidence that they could win. And, you know, when we moved towards 1972, that right to work became a clarion call, so much so that by February 1972, there was you could only call it a revolt by workers demanding the right to work. It was, you know, there were over 200 working style disputes over the following couple of years. And in February 1972, there was the convening of the first Scottish Assembly by the Scottish Trade Union Congress, which over 1,000 delegates attended from right across trade unions, local authorities, churches, chambers of commerce and shop stewards. And the demand put at that People's Assembly was for a Scottish Parliament, but it was for a Parliament that could protect the real wealth of the Scottish people as represented by the labour movement in that hall, and it was to be a workers' parliament. So I think you can actually see a thread of a raising of consciousness and a need to change things that leads right through to the Scottish Parliament that was created over 25 years later. And sadly, I think we've still got a long, long way to go in creating the workers' parliament that would have the sort of transformative effect on our economy envisaged by our leadership by, you know, at that point in time. But I think, you know, it's worth us thinking about that in the context of where we need to go next with a people's recovery. I think it's now on us as a movement to deliver that legacy and deliver a parliament that truly is a workers' parliament here in Scotland. So for me, the UCS working, it wasn't just a fine example of how to run an industrial dispute or a campaign. It was also a great example of how to escalate political pressure, how to leverage decision makers, even when that decision maker was an anti-union Tory government. And they did it very successfully. They managed to engineer a complete climb down. And that did have positive ramifications for our movement that are still felt today. And, you know, I think it's also a great example of how a trade union centre like the STUC can use its position to support workers in struggle. I think it's absolutely right that we should do that as a movement and as a trade union centre. And I certainly hope that going forward, we will continue to see that as part of our proud tradition to deliver that sort of practical and material support to workers in struggle and to bring that solidarity from the wider movement, because I think in the period ahead we're going to have to become once again a well-oiled fighting machine when it comes to defending our members' pay and conditions as we move out of this pandemic. So in winding up, I'd just like to add some reflections based on, I suppose, on my experience of campaigns, various campaigns before coming back into the STUC in the role of General Secretary. And I just want to think about what, you know, I think all good campaigns have a little bit of UCS in them. The first campaign I was ever involved in was actually as the convener of office support staff in the benefits agency. And that's when I was an activist in what is now the PCS union, the Civil Servants Union. And myself and the shop stewards in my branch led a successful campaign to stop our contract being privatised by campaigning for the right to mount an in-house bid and ultimately winning that contract. So, you know, and we tried taking the strike action against privatisation, that wasn't working. We tried to do the work to rule, that wasn't working. And I suppose we took them on at their own game. And what that had in common with the UCS dispute was that we thought out the box. You know, we thought, well, actually, let's mount our own bid, let's keep it in-house, and let's show that we can, you know, we can see off any bid from the private sector, and that we can prove that it's more efficient for this work to stay within the public sector. We had many barriers in our way, but we did not let that deter us. And I sometimes look back and think that naivety is a wonderful thing, because you're not taught yet that you probably might not win. But we got there and we achieved the result we wanted to achieve, and we kept that contract in-house. Another campaign that stands out for me was working with the organising team in Unite Scotland, where we supported an incredibly brave group of workers at GE Caledonian to win recognition in the face of, you know, GE's second biggest company in the world, American owned. They will not allow unions to unionise their sites where they're, you know, where they're not unionised. They employed very high level union busters. One of Unite's predecessors had previously tried to unionise that site and failed. We'd been locked out for 3 years according to the CEC rules when this was handed to our team. And the thing that this had in common with the UCS dispute was that there was 2 years spent planning for that campaign before we redid it, and we built trust. We built a really skilled, really trusting team of leaders and workers, and built up a leadership in secret before that campaign ever went live. And they had a fantastic double act in Jim Frew and Graham Ure as the co-conveners of that group. They had an organising committee of 30 workers covering all shifts in all areas across a site that was 800 strong. And I remember thinking at the time that they really were a perfect double act, the two conveners, and probably quite reminiscent of Reid and Early, given the charisma they had. But the key point was it was a really solid group. And, you know, when things got really hard, they had already been inoculated. They'd already been shown the playbook of the union busters and exactly what was going to get thrown at them in every stage. And they withstood that, and they were successful. And I was very proud to see them a couple of years down the line winning the TUC Organising Award. But if you look at that whole thing from beginning to end, it was a 5-year slog for those workers who showed incredible bravery, you know, in the face of the worldwide vice president of the company come to tell them all he was going to shut down the site if they voted to unionise. Those workers chose to vote to have a union in. And it was one of the most inspiring campaigns that I've ever been involved in, given the bravery of that workforce. And I'd also just want to finally touch on Unite's leverage campaigns. And Mary gave you a more recent example of the BA campaign and some of the tactics were used in that. One of the ones where I helped coordinate the field actions was the Crossrail campaign to reinstate Frank Morris. Which saw him taken back on to Crossrail. Frank Morris was an electrician who whistle blew about health and safety concerns. He was sacked, and Unite put a massive campaign in to get him reinstated, and also to get union recognition and access across the Crossrail sites. And the way Unite Leverage works, it effectively declares war on an employer. It sets a very clear demand, and it makes that demand to the identified decision makers, and then it escalates a plan designed to make it more painful ultimately for the decision maker not to give in to the demand than it would be for them to give into it. And it involves an escalation that builds pressure on the target day after day after day. It can target their clients, their other business interests, their business partners, shareholders, suppliers, regulators, sponsors, etc., etc. And the idea is that that escalation will not stop until the demand is met, and there will be no compromises. And I think that sort of approach, you know, also echoes what worked about the UCS campaign, because they weren't going to compromise, and they kept going until they saved all the yards. And that took a real leap of faith, because there were a lot of false dawns dangled before them along the way. And, you know, these are only a few limited examples of my own experience of, you know, being very proud to have been involved in some great campaigns that I think had a little bit of UCS. But, you know, I'm also proud to see that, you know, on from the 50 years ago when we get the 80,000 on the streets for UCS, we had 100,000 on the streets for the Stop the War demo in 2003 in Scotland. We had 80k on the streets of Glasgow to defend public sector pensions. We had 30,000 teachers who marched in 2018, and 10,000 women who took to the streets in Glasgow's equal pay strike. So these are all contemporary examples of mass mobilisations that have taken place, you know, in the last 20 years. And I think that we have to realise that we are still able to pull off winning campaigns. There are so many different industrial actions that take place, and I'd like to put a call out of solidarity to our EIS FELA teachers who are standing up today and taking industrial action in the face of Colleges Scotland reneging on a deal that they'd already made in good faith. And that is a whole agenda about downgrading lecturers and getting the job done on the cheap. And those workers are standing up against that. But, you know, all successful campaigns have winning ingredients, and they're the same ingredients that were present within the UCS campaign. And, you know, as far as I'm concerned, we should be teaching this stuff to our kids at school, because in the challenging period ahead, we're going to need all of these skills and more, because we need to build a people's recovery, and we need to build a fairer Scotland. And I've got no doubt that if we take that lesson from UCS with us and keep that in our minds, then we certainly will be able to do that. Thank you.
That was brilliant, Roz. You know you're at a good meeting when you get a chill down your spine when people are speaking. I mean, I think that one of the absolute theme that's running through tonight is this notion of leadership being authentic, leadership of the working class must come from within the working class, leadership from within the union must come from within the workers, and leadership of a community must be part of that community. There was a number of points put into the chat that I'm going to try and kind of bring everything together and come back to all of our speakers to try and respond to the points kind of holistically. Then I'm going to ask a question of my own. The number of points that we're kind of pointing to, it's not just industrial disputes, but organising workers is a method for bringing about kind of wins. The point about the role of unions within communities is really important in placing the workers within the community from which they are working in, living in, existing in. And the point I wanted the question I want to put back to all of you is, could there be another UCS today? Could we have a working, and I'm asking this in a kind of bizarre world that we currently live in, where people are not working in, but they're working from home in the main. But, you know, today in Scotland, what's the potential for the planning, the strategy, the tactics, and the ability to deliver and win, not necessarily a working as such, but an event, an activity, a mobilisation of our class to that extent. So I'm going to ask Bill first of all, who didn't actually speak in the session, if you want to come back in first, Bill. We've got you on mute at the moment, Bill. See if we can.
How's that?
That's it.
Yeah, what I was saying is that I'm a historian. I write about history. I don't make history. The people that have spoken tonight, these are the people that make history. We, or historians in the future, will write about these people and analyze in the light of hindsight the strengths and weaknesses of the contribution, the campaigns, the thought, and so on. So in terms of me giving them advice about how to organize, how to build solidarity would be a bit arrogant on my part, because these people do it for a living, I don't. But in terms of the UCS working, I think that both the women that spoke tonight have fit in all the right issues. You know, key thing is one, solidarity initially within the workplace, but also making alliances outside the workplace. And framing your campaign in such a way as you show yourselves to be moral, good, decent human beings, as against the immorality, as what we've talked about, the faceless men in London who are making decisions about their life, your lives. They know nothing about your lives. They don't know even nothing about the area you live in. You know, they've got no idea, no conception. So I think the one thing that the stewards were very good at doing was, one, raising the moral issue, but also building alliances with different groups in society. You've got to remember that even female Tory associations were sending donations. So, you know, I'm not, and the other thing that was stressed tonight was the inspirational leadership. Now, inspiring leaders like that don't come along very often, you know, you've got to admit that. So, as I say, these are the things I would point to. Whether this is the basis for that kind of thing in Scotland today, I think there's a case in Britain where we could have gone out and strike, a general strike, and support the health workers. That would have done an enormous amount of good. You have the goodwill of everybody in British society, from the rich down to the poor, for what the NHS has achieved during this pandemic. To be offer heroes, you know, 1%. You know, you've got a cast iron case right away for building solidarity on that one issue. But as I say, I don't want to give any advice. I'm not well placed to do it. Maybe Alan knows more about these things.
I think that's a cue for you, Alan, to come in next.
I think it was, Dan. Thank you very much. Yeah, I would agree with our other speakers that, you know, the key about is framing the narrative in a way which is expansive, it's open-ended, it's a campaign. You know, even a short-run strike like in 1952 when Reid was involved. He came up with an emotive phrase about he was getting paid less in a week than it would cost for putting a dog in kennels. So, you know, it was something which was, it's not just a catchy phrase, it's something which captures a material reality. It really does. And as Roz was mentioning there, some of these things about how people learn to, I don't think, Reid nearly may well have been exceptional, but I suspect he had an exceptional background as much as personal qualities. The personal qualities are something that, you know, that folk are blessed with, of course they are. But the other things is about learning how to speak, learning how to build a narrative, how to campaign. That does take years, and these individuals were seasoned campaigners, and they brought that to bear, plus that imagination, that Marxist political imagination, because that's what it was, and all those contacts. So whether we've got a political party now that could mobilise, that we could use to mobilise around those sorts of issues, it would have to be involved in the left of the Labour Party, of course, but there's not much there. You know, let's be honest, we're talking about a period of rebuilding the grassroots, and it's more that the Labour Party and that broad left round about it has to learn from the type of campaigning that's been done from Unite rather than anything else. And so those sorts of things about winning individual battles are important, but it's about, as you say, a green and fairer future, building a better peace, a better post-pandemic. That's the sort of language that we need to be able to articulate and campaign within. Yeah, that would my top as well.
Brilliant, Alan, thank you very much. And Mary?
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, I think that I was just sort of reflecting on some of the comments regarding community, and of course, you know, Unite has community membership, which I think is really, really important. And I'm based in Edinburgh, and our union works a lot with local community groups on different campaigns in lots of different areas. So the one that comes to mind most recently is Another Edinburgh is Possible, which is a coalition of different groups. Right, the most recent activity that's been done by Another Edinburgh is Possible is about the budget cuts, which affect everybody. Obviously, you know, the cuts to services, the impact on workers of you know, the redundancies and the slashing of the budget. So I think that's a good example of you know, working together, and we need to do that much more. I mean, we do that in lots of different areas, but we need to do that much more and build you know, much bigger from that learning together and that understanding and empathy that we have. In terms of the sort of, could there be another UCS working? Well, yes, of course, there could be. But I think, as we've seen through looking at the UCS working, there was a combination of factors which came together and, you know, provided and there was a number of elements in it. So there was, you know, the inspiration of Jimmy Reid and Ailey and the two Sammys and their leadership. That was really important. It was about the wider you know, political and economic landscape. So, you know, the spectre of unemployment. There was also, you know, the spectre of the shipyards obviously closing. So there was, and there was a determination with the message in there as well. So there was a number of elements which were all brought together, and you know, the time was right for that. And I think, you know, it astonishes me, given everything that's happened with the UK government during the last year in the pandemic, and you know, I mentioned the test and trace, that people aren't, well, they can't be out in the streets because of the pandemic, but an outraged and, you know, coming together and making such a noise and protesting really loudly about what is happening. And I think, you know, I think we'll come to that, but our role as unions is we have to build that with the community, and we've got to come from those communities so that we understand, you know, what the challenges and how people are affected by them. So that, I think that's really all I've got to say. I'm conscious that of other people said.
Thank you very much, Mary. And then finally, Roz.
Thanks, Lynn. I think just reflecting in terms of just summing up and where we are now, you know, I think there's a lot we can take just in that, some of the stuff that's been said there around, you know, the concept of anger that's there just now. People have been through a lot. People have really suffered. You know, we're talking about 10,000 deaths in Scotland, 125,000 deaths across the UK. A lot of these deaths were preventable deaths, and we have realised that, you know, bad work has killed Austerity has killed. Not having a proper safety net in our country where we've got decent sick pay and decent unemployment benefit has killed and helped this pandemic spread. What has been done has not been good enough, and the people who've been out looking after everyone are, you know, among the people who are on the most poverty pay in our country: the delivery drivers, the supermarket workers, the carers, the cleaners, the low-paid public sector workers. You know, you only have to go to a local government branch to feel the palpable anger simmering away about how ignored and undervalued people are feeling. And I think we really just need to think now about anger, hope and action, and about how we mobilise that and focus that going forward, because we need to demand change coming out of this, just like they got change coming out of the Second World War. You know, we got a welfare state, we got a national health service, we got free education, we got decent housing. We're pretty much at a point where we need some fundamental change once again in our society, and I think trade unionists are going to have a huge role to play in harnessing some of that narrative and really, you know, creating the sort of campaigns where we demand more for what we've been through.
Excellent. I couldn't agree with any of you more. So just in kind of closing this evening, I think that one of the things that we have really focused on here tonight has been that discussion that we often have in the movement around leadership and leadership qualities, and that, you know, we pull out people like Jimmy as a hero, as an exceptional leader, but Jimmy and Jimmy Reid and Jimmy Earley and others like people here tonight, like Roz and Mary, are leaders because of where they've come from, as well as where they were and where they've been and who they're with. And I think that when Alan introduced his presentation and he spent some detail talking about the strategic organising, the strategic planning of the work, and, you know, through the Shop Stewards Committee, through the discipline of the Communist Party, but building that outwards and not just being an industrial dispute, to actually build up those broad and popular fronts, to be rooted in community, to be rooted in some of the things that Roz and Mary went on to describe, that Unite does so well around kind of leveraging and making sure that the bosses and the leadership and the authority and the politicians kind of know who's biting their bum, if you like, coming up their backside to tell them. And I think that you know, leadership is also about vision and fearlessness, and kind of bringing people together around those visions. So yes, I think it's a good moment to reflect on, you know, what kind of society we're moving into. And I know that in the chat that the Just Transition Commission's report's been mentioned, as well as the STUC's People's Recovery. I think we can all you know, take hope from that, but we also all need to get organised and go out there and use what Roz describes as anger, hope and action to actually start making the change that didn't just begin at UCS, but UCS was a kind of key moment in our time. And my final point is, Roz mentioned the pension strike that we all took part in. And that, for me, in my lifetime, was one of the biggest moments of class solidarity I have ever experienced, because there might have been 80,000 people on the streets of Glasgow, but there were people lining the streets clapping because they too were on strike. It wasn't just those that were marching through the streets, but everyone else as well. It was absolutely immense, and that was that real sense of, you know, the whole city was out. The whole city was out, and the whole, you know, wasn't just in Glasgow, but across the whole of the UK. So I'm going to bring the meeting to a close, but there's a couple of things I want to mention. I want to thank the STUC for the use of their Zoom license, and in particular thank Tam Wilson, who has been brilliantly pulling all this together in the background and supporting all of the speakers. I want to thank Gregor Gall, who's the director of the Jimmy Reid Foundation, who's also been pulling everything together and has been put a lot of information in the chat there. The Reid Foundation is always looking for your solidarity, but also for your donations and support. So information is being provided about that. Our next meeting in the series on UCS is on the 18th of April, here again on Zoom, and it's on the eve of the STUC conference. And I know that Mary is one of our speakers at that event as well, along with Linda Hamill, who's a UCS veteran, and others. So I do hope that you'll join us again, and I do hope that you feel as inspired as I do from tonight's meeting. I want to thank Alan and Bill and Roz and Mary for your fantastic contributions and the work that you all do on behalf of our class. So have a good evening, everybody, and thanks once again. And we'll see you.
Thanks very much, folks. First class, excellent, excellent. Thank you.